Today, we're going to start a brand new chapter, a brand new topic, and that is the topic of quadratic functions. Now, what is a quadratic function? A quadratic function is basically the polynomials, the trinomials, and the binomials that we've been factoring and adding and multiplying and dealing with in the last chapter. That's what a quadratic function is once we make it an equation. So if we take a trinomial and add an equal sign to it, or a binomial and add an equal sign to it, it becomes a quadratic function. When graphed, a quadratic function is a parabola, a U, or an upside down U like this. Earlier this year, we talked about linear functions. A linear function is an equation that when you graph, it becomes a straight line. A quadratic function is one that when you graph, it becomes a parabola, or a U. But once again, really what a quadratic function is a trinomial or a binomial that we've been dealing with. When you make it into an equation, it becomes a quadratic function. In this chapter, we're specifically going to talk about how to solve them, how to figure out what the roots are, how to figure out what the solutions are. We'll talk about that here today. So for example, this is an example of a quadratic function. Y equals x squared plus 5x minus 36. This is a trinomial. Just like we've been factoring, we can factor it, we can do lots of things with it. But today, we're going to make it into a quadratic function, which means we're going to make it into an equal sign or an equation, and one side is going to be a y. Now, in order to solve this, however, we can't have an equation with two variables in it, so we're going to make the y a 0. So a quadratic function is like this. So this is what you're going to see in this chapter, is a problem like this. Your job is to solve this equation. When I say solve, just like we did at the beginning of the year, we're talking about what number can I plug in for this x and this x to try to make it a true statement. What number can I plug in here and here? It has to be the same number because they both represent x, and it makes it a true statement. For example, could I plug in 1? If I plug in 1 here and here, does it make it true? 1 squared is 1. 5 times 1 is 5. So 1 plus 5 is 6. 6 minus 36. Does that equal 0? No, it does not. So 1 does not work. What number can I plug in here and here, and I work this side out after I plug it in, and it makes it a true statement? Basically, it means this side is equal to 0. So I want you to pause the video now, and I want you to try to figure out in your head what number works. All right, now hopefully you figure out what number works. There's actually two numbers that work. One is the number 4, and one is the number -9. These are both solutions. If I were to plug in 4, 4 squared is 16. 4 times 5 is 20. 16 plus 20 is 36. 36 minus 36 is 0. 4 works. -9 also works. If you plug in -9 here, you plug in -9 here, and you work this out, it also comes out to 0. So in a quadratic function, this is in a quadratic function. In a quadratic function, there are two solutions. We also call these solutions roots. So anytime you see the word roots, I will reference that a lot in this chapter. If ever you see the word roots, that just means solutions. That's a synonym for the word solutions. So if you ever hear roots, that just means find the solutions, find the answers. Sometimes they're also referred to as the zeros of the function. So I know sometimes on the ACT, for example, it may give you a quadratic function like this and say, what are the roots? All that means are, what are the answers? What are the solutions? What are the numbers that I can plug in and it make it true? Sometimes it may say, what are the zeros of the function? Same thing, what are the solutions? What numbers can I plug in and it makes it true? Okay? So I just want you to be aware, the word roots and zeros of the function all mean the same thing, they mean the solutions. Now, something I forgot to mention at the beginning is, how do I know this is what we call a quadratic function? How do I know it will make a parabola? And the answer is that you have a term that is x squared. So anytime you have the exponent of 2, you have something x squared, it is what we call a quadratic function. Earlier this year, we talked about linear equations, or linear functions. That makes a straight line. This is quadratic, which, as we talked about earlier, makes a parabola or U on the graph. Why? Because it has an x squared. So anytime you see an x squared, that makes it a quadratic function. And that's what we're dealing with in this chapter. So our solutions in this particular problem are 4 and -9. We also call them roots. We also call them zeros of the function. Now in this chapter, your job on every problem is to find the solutions. You have to find the roots. You have to figure out what are the answers. Okay? There are 3 different possible number of solutions. There are 3 possible number of roots in any quadratic function. The first possibility is you will have 2 roots or 2 solutions, like the last problem. On the last problem, how many solutions did we have? 2, 4, -9. You will typically have 2 solutions. I would say 95% of the time when it's a quadratic function, you will have 2 solutions. So when in doubt, you should have 2 answers on every problem, because most problems will have 2 roots or 2 solutions. The second possibility is sometimes you only have 1 solution. You only have 1 answer. That happens sometimes, but like I said earlier, I'd say 95% of the time you will have 2 roots or 2 solutions. So sometimes you have 2 solutions, sometimes you only have 1 solution, and last but not least, you may have no solution. There may be a time where there is no number in the world. You could sit there and think about it in your head forever and ever, and there's never going to be a number that you can plug in, work it out, and it makes it true. It's just not possible. So typically, like I said, about 95% of the time, you're going to have 2 solutions. Sometimes you're only going to have 1 solution, and sometimes you're not going to have any solutions. But usually, you will have 2 roots or 2 solutions. So in this chapter, if you have any doubts, make sure you have 2 roots down, because typically you will probably have 2 answers. Now, in this particular problem earlier, I had you find the roots, find the solutions. I asked you to do that in your head. Typically, we're not going to be able to do these in our head. They're going to be too complicated. There's going to be too many numbers. Sometimes there may even be fractions and different things like that. You're not going to be able to do them in your head. So we're going to have to work this out algebraically. There are actually 5 methods to solve a quadratic function algebraically. And what we're going to do now is I'm going to just give you those 5 methods. We're not going to do them all today. That's going to be saved for a different video. We're just going to give you, I just want you to have down and have in your notes and be aware of all 5 of the methods. There are 5 methods to solve a quadratic function. And that's really what this chapter is built around, is we are going to talk about the different 5 methods of solving. The first method is called graphing. You will take a quadratic function, you will graph it, and then based upon what the graph looks like, you will be able to figure out what the solutions or the roots are. The second method is by factoring. Those of you who are good at factoring, we just spent a whole long time factoring, didn't we? If you can factor, this method will be very, very easy for you. You have to be able to factor, but if you can factor, you should not have any problems. The next method is by using what we call square roots. Now, the thing with this method is it only works on certain problems. And we'll talk about that when we get to that video. But it only works on certain types of quadratic functions. It doesn't actually work on all types. Same thing with factoring, actually. If it's not able to be factored, if you remember, sometimes we had some that were prime that we couldn't factor. If it was prime, we could not do the factoring method. The next method, number 4, is called completing the square. That is one method we're actually not going to talk about at all. All right? The other methods are much easier. This method is kind of difficult, and the other methods are just easier to do. So we're not going to focus on that one. The last method is called a quadratic formula. The quadratic formula, when you first see it, is going to look really, really complicated, but once you actually work it out, it's pretty easy. The quadratic formula is just it's a formula, and you plug in numbers into the formula, and it works it out, and it'll pop out an answer, and once you get the hang of it, it's pretty simple. So these are the 5 methods to solve a quadratic function. And we're going to be talking about at least most of them throughout the upcoming weeks.